Hello, hello. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Isabel, and I run the Journey Further Book Club. The book club is a free digital library designed for people like you with your personal and professional development. And we're going to help you with that through the power of books. So we do that through our weekly newsletter, which you can sign up to in the comments. And we also host monthly discussions about the books we read. And most excitingly, we get to speak to the authors of those books, as we're going to do this evening. So I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Therese Huston, who's just written her third book, Let's Talk, which is all about how to make effective feedback your superpower. So welcome, Therese.
Thank you so much, Isabel. It's a treat to be here.
Well, thank you for joining me. And thank you for writing your book. So I'd love to jump straight in and ask you to explain how you kind of got to here writing a book about how to give effective feedback.
So, my motto is that we all deserve great feedback, but through no fault of our own, most of us don't receive great feedback. I've surveyed managers, and giving feedback is one of the most stressful parts of being a manager. So stressful that some managers just don't do it. Right? They don't say the critical things. And I think part of the problem is that we're not trained to give feedback. I'm doing a program right now at the Said Business School at Oxford University on how to be a better leader. And we're almost done with the program, and we haven't talked about how to give feedback, even though it's something that all of us have to do in our jobs as leaders. So it's a stressful confrontation potentially. We're not trained to do it. And the surprising thing is there's really good research on how to give effective feedback. And so part of my inspiration for writing the book was to take this great feedback. I'm a cognitive scientist by training. So take the great research that's out there on how to give feedback and translate it into practices that any manager can use. So that's my professional inspiration. And then I'll share a brief story, a personal inspiration. I had some really critical, pivotal moments early in my career around feedback. I was in my early 30s, and I had just finished my first year on a job, and I had made a big career change. So I wanted to know, am I doing a good job or not? So I asked my boss, could we do an annual performance review? And she said yes, but she was really busy. So she said, let's do it over lunch. I'm like, okay, great. We'll go out to lunch. So we go out to lunch. We're having a lovely time. We're talking. I'm about to get married. So we talk about my fiance. We talk about her husband, lots of back and forth, but we don't talk about my job at all. So we get to the end of the lunch and we're paying the bill. And I think, okay, I need to bring this up on the walk back to the office. And she says, can we duck into the toilet for just a moment before we walk back? And I'm like, oh, sure. And I'm not kidding, Isabel. We get into our stalls and she launches into, Therese, so let's talk about year one. I'm like, no, not now, not now. And it makes me realize how powerless the feedback recipient is. I was already nervous about this conversation, but she delivered that feedback in a public place. I couldn't write anything down. I don't know who's going to walk in in a bathroom. Exactly. Managers, I think she had good intentions, but managers clearly can flub feedback even when they have really good intentions. And so I'm trying to help managers navigate that. It's probably pretty obvious that you shouldn't give feedback in a restroom, but there are plenty of mistakes managers make, and I'm trying to help them avoid those.
Yeah, that does definitely seem like quite an extreme version of ineffective feedback. But I guess before we talk about how to make effective feedback your superpower, as the book is titled, I'd love to know what kind of maybe more moderate forms of ineffective feedback can look like, and that many managers can kind of fall foul of.
So my book goes into many different types of mistakes that people make when they're giving feedback, but I'll give you three here that are really common based on my interviews and based on other research. So one kind of ineffective feedback is all criticism and no praise. So Zenger and Folkman did a study of over 7,000 employees, and they found that 37% admit that they don't give any positive reinforcement, that they don't praise people for good work. And when they probed further, why don't you tell people that they do good work? And managers especially said, well, my value added is to let people know where they can improve. So they thought that they were giving effective feedback by only focusing on the problems, whereas when employees were surveyed, they thought the most effective feedback givers were the managers who praised a lot right? So one of the problems that managers have is they think they're helping by being critical when actually they're helping by giving praise, mostly praise, and then a little bit of advice. So the first problem is all criticism, no praise. A second form of ineffective feedback is the vague compliment. I don't know if you've ever heard this, Isabel, but you might have been told, like, you're doing great work, just keep it up, or keep doing what you're doing. Or if no news is good news, right? You're like, that doesn't help me.
Yeah. What am I supposed to do with that?
What am I supposed to, of the 50 things I did this week, which one should I keep doing, right? So
Yeah.
that's that vague praise is a problem. And then the third really common form of ineffective feedback is that people focus on the story, not the data. So let's say that Alex normally replies to your emails within 24 hours. And you've noticed over the past 2 weeks, it's taking Alex 3 or 4 days to reply to your email. A lot of managers would start that conversation by saying, Alex, you seem kind of overwhelmed. That's jumping to an interpretation, right? And Alex might get really defensive. She might be like, I'm not overwhelmed. Why would you think I'm overwhelmed? This is questioning her professional credibility, right?
Mm-hmm.
A much better way to begin is to start with the data. So you might simply start with, hey, I've noticed that in the past, your emails, you've been like so on it. Within 24 hours, I get a reply from you. But in the past week or two, it's taken more like 3 or 4 days. Are you okay? So starting with that data, and then it gives Alex a chance to explain what's going on. And then you could even get to a point where you're like, oh, good, I thought maybe you were just overwhelmed. But save that interpretation for the end. Don't start there. Because if you start there, you make that person immediately defensive. And so those would be 3 things. All criticism and no praise is a problem. Vague praise is a problem. And then starting with your interpretation, which many of us think, oh, I'm being so compassionate because I'm noticing that she's overwhelmed. Nope. Alex doesn't want to hear your story. She wants to stick to the facts.
Yeah, and let people have the opportunity to tell the story themselves.
And that's just it, right? They want to tell their own story because it's going to feel unfair. Your story probably will feel like the incomplete story.
Amazing. Well, so I have to say, I was kind of drawn initially to your book. So the way that the book club works is that every quarter we focus on a different theme that specifically affects very busy professional people who work in the kind of the digital sector. And obviously over the last year now, with working from home and, unusual working conditions, I guess the lines have been blurred more than ever between what we can control and what we can't, and how much control we have over our daily lives. So we're currently focusing on the idea of change and how to make change happen, and then using different books to look at that at different levels. So we started by looking at an individual level, and kind of how we can control our own mental health and anxiety when it comes to work. And we're currently looking at the idea of systemic change. So we're using a book called The Conversation by Dr. Robert Livingston. I've actually got it next to me.
Nice. Plug. Oh, show.
Yeah. For Robert. Yeah.
Nice. I love that.
And Robert's book is all about how we can and should be talking more productively about racism and how systemic racism exists in organizations. And so I was particularly drawn to your book for some of the research that you've done on how women and people of color particularly can receive a less feedback generally and of a worse quality than other groups. And I'd love for you to kind of give us a bit more information on how that kind of unconscious bias seems to affect women and people of color disproportionately when it comes to giving effective feedback.
I'm so glad you raised this issue because it's something that a lot of people don't know about, that they assume that their feedback is just based on merit and it's just based on the quality of the work. Are you doing good work? Are you not doing good work? But there's growing evidence in just about every field that's studied: law, medicine, the military, in technology and finance. In every discipline where it's studied so far, there's data that women get better feedback than men. So I'll talk about the gender bias in feedback. And then there's less data. There have been fewer research studies, but there's growing research, like you said, that basically white people get better feedback than Black people. So, and depending on where you live, then there are other racial groups that are disadvantaged. In the United States, Latinx employees get worse feedback. There's some data in the UK that Asian employees get worse feedback. But let's start on the gender issue, because there's a lot more data showing that women get crummy feedback compared to men. And if you're a guy who's watching this, you might be thinking, Therese, I also get crummy feedback. It's not that men get perfect, glowing feedback that just launches their careers, but when bad feedback is being handed out, it's more often handed out to women. So let's first just focus on the frequency of feedback. There was a great study published in 2020 there in the UK, where they surveyed 2,000 UK employees who worked at organizations that had at least 50 people. So these weren't really small, two-person companies, but at least 50 people. And the key question was, how often do you get feedback? Okay, pretty straightforward. This data might come as a surprise. 43% of the men in the study indicated that they got feedback from their manager at least once a week. 43%, almost half of the men are getting feedback from their manager once a week, at least once a week, whereas only 29% of women said that they got feedback once a week. And they found similar patterns. Do you get feedback from the people who report to you? Do you get feedback from your peers? In every category, men were getting more feedback than women. And some women might be really surprised and wish that they got feedback once a week. They're happy with once a month, but men are more likely to get coaching and be told how to improve, or praise. They also get more praise. So one of the issues is just frequency of feedback. Then on the issue of race, the basic finding, I'll describe the basic finding and then get a little bit into the data. The basic finding is that when managers are giving feedback to white employees, they tend to focus on their competence. So in written performance reviews, they'll use words like excellent, superb, analytical, creative, right? They're really focusing on their performance. In contrast, for Black employees, the data indicates that managers are more likely to focus on their personal qualities. So they are nice, they're open, they're so pleasant, they're so friendly. And it's lovely to be called these things, right, Isabel? You'd like to be called friendly and pleasant and open. But when you sit down to compare two employees' performance reviews, and you have a white employee who's called highly analytical and a game changer and innovative, and you have a Black employee who's called really friendly with customers and such an open personality, who are you going to promote? Right? That one's it's pretty obvious it's going to be the white employee. And you might just point to well, obviously the white employee has a greater skill set. We're glad that we have the Black employee, but the white employee is management material. And this is such a consistent pattern that, the advice to give is to, if you need to go sit down with your written performance reviews, if you're a leader or a manager, and sit down, close the door if you need to, and take a good hard look at what adjectives you use to describe your white employees over your Black or your Asian or your Latinx employees, because the data would suggest you're likely to use different adjectives, and the adjectives you're using for white employees suggest management track. And the adjectives you're using for your Black and Asian employees suggest customer service, right? Which some people like to work customer service, but plenty of us want to be on that management track.
Absolutely. And there needs to be a fair platform for everybody to be able to reach those levels.
Exactly. And I think it's surprising because people might think that they would pad their comments to someone of a different race, and there's plenty of data to show that. If you're offering criticism, people tend to do something called protective hesitation. Protective hesitation is like you hold back from the critical comments if someone is of a different race. And so we might expect that we would give different critical feedback, and there's definitely data to show that, but there's also data to show we give different praise, and that's really important. That's a place that we can all pay attention to.
Absolutely. So for any managers listening and watching this, who are wanting to give kind of a fairer quality of feedback across the board, where would you advise them to start?
Well, in my book, I try to give readers a wealth of tips depending on your different personality style and your different kinds of employees that you have. But I'll give 3 quick tips that I think apply across management styles and across fields. So the first tip would be, and this is going to sound super simple, but just double the amount of praise that you give, right? University of Michigan researchers found that the highest performing teams received 5.6 pieces of praise to every one criticism, right? So almost 6 pieces of praise. Now, when you hear that, I'm often, I'm kind of reminded of the movie Office Space and like the pieces of flair, right? Like that's a lot of praise. But another team has studied, because you might think, well, is it because they're great performers that they get more praise? And they actually find that actually it's the praise that comes first. Teams that are praised then do better work. So the praise, if it comes first, it actually motivates people because they know they're going to get recognized for good work. So first of all, double how much praise you give. My second tip is to state your good intentions out loud. This one's not as obvious. It's a step most of us skip. But researchers Leslie John and her team at Harvard Business School find that if you have bad news to give, state your good intentions first, and the other person will be much more receptive. I just did this last week with a colleague. He was preparing to meet a new client, and he was telling me about how he was going to approach the first meeting with this new client. And I thought, oh, this is not going to go well. But if I started there, I knew he'd be defensive. So what I started with, obviously, right, because he'd worked really hard on this. So I started with my good intention. I said, I want you to make a great impression. You've worked so hard to prepare for this client, and I'm concerned that, and then I went into my concern. And I've got to tell you, Isabel, he was so locked on to like, oh my gosh, I do want to make a good impression. What do I need to do? Right. So state, it's really simple. State, I want this good thing for you. And then my third tip, and this one's maybe not every manager can use this, but to say, it's not like you. So, Alex has been slow to reply to your email. So, it's really not like you to take a few days to reply to email. What's going on there? Saying it's not like you gives that person an out because you're not labeling it as part of their personality. Or, it's not like you to be so, it's not like you to do that kind of preparation for a new client. So what's your concern there, right? By saying that's not like you, it gives the person to explain, here's what I'm hoping for, or here's why this situation is different. So that's really nice because then you can have a real problem-solving conversation with the person. So double how much praise you give, state your good intentions, and say it's not like you, and you'll be surprised at how much more effective your feedback lands.
Thank you, Therese. That's really fascinating. And of course, I would urge anyone to grab themselves a copy of Therese's new book, Let's Talk, to dive into those tactics in more detail.
There we go. Yeah.
There we go. I've got
my
copy here too.
Yeah, you got your copy too.
I've actually got a different copy too.
Oh, you do? Oh, you've got the UK version, of course. Yeah, I've got the US version. Yeah.
Well, yes, I would just like to, for everyone watching, if you have a question you'd like to ask Therese, I hope you don't mind, Therese. Do pop that in the comments. We've got a couple of minutes left, so get your questions in. But Therese, I'd now like to ask you. So we, as I mentioned, we are the Journey Further Book Club, and we view books as an incredibly important tool for our ongoing learning and development. If you could recommend one book to our members, what would it be?
So I love that you're reading The Conversation. That's on my to-do list. I think I'll probably get it on Audible tomorrow or later this week. So I'm glad that you're reading that one. I hear good things about it. Have you read The Art of Gathering? Has that been on your list? Oh, no. This is a great one. So the author's name is Priya Parker. And this book was written before COVID, and it's about how to have better gatherings. But I read it during COVID, and I still found so many of the concepts applicable, even though you can't gather in person right now. We'll get back to that. It won't be too far off. But it's not a book about manners. It's not a book about how to do place settings or, how to do your invite list. It's not that at all. Instead, it's about how to have memorable gatherings in terms of what the purpose of the gathering is, how you organize the time together, and actually the importance of having a structure. She points out that we're in a laid back culture where nobody wants to impose structure on social gatherings. And she said, because you're trying to be cool or laid back or whatever it is that you're trying to go for. And she said, people really appreciate a structure. One of her chapters that I really like, I wrote it down, is never start a funeral with logistics. is the title of one of the chapters.
Okay.
Isn't that great? And I have been to events where, you're here for some big purpose, and the person starts off by explaining, like, if you're parked in this lot, you'll need to move your car. They start with the
Yeah.
logistics. You're like, why are we doing this? Please don't start here. And so she gives great ideas for how to help make an event memorable, how to make it risky, which I never think about, but I love her notion of making things risky. And I found that,
What's the benefit of making it risky? Why is that an important thing to do?
well, so it really clarifies the purpose. So she makes this great argument that, all too often when people are having a wedding, let's say, the purpose of the wedding is just to bring our families together. Okay, so neutral purpose, everyone can agree on that. And she points out that if you can add an element of personalization that adds a little bit of risk, you make it much more purposeful for the people who are coming. So an example of that might be, the risky thing to say might be something like, isn't going to sound that risky, but to say something like, the purpose of this wedding is to bring together the people who are going to make sure that we have a lifelong marriage, and who are going to ask us the hard questions when we need to be asked, right?
Yeah.
So all of a sudden it's like, whoa, I'm going to play a role in helping them stay together as a couple. Can I, how would I do that? It makes it much more thoughtful, right? You feel kind of a call to action now, that you wouldn't feel if it was just, let's bring two families together, right? Or let's have a nice picnic or whatever, however you might frame the, like, here's the purpose of our wedding. Instead, you can make it something that people can get behind. And I thought it's just a lovely book that energizes me. I'm looking forward to when COVID's over, having my very first dinner party and doing something risky with it. I've done dinner parties in the past where I've asked people to bring a dish that starts with a letter of their name, right? So in your case, you'd bring something that starts with an I. It's not really that risky, but it does constrain people, right, in a way that most dinner parties don't. And then it's really fun because now we've got a conversation topic, right? Everybody's talking about why they brought X, they brought their middle initial or whatever, and it gets the party going.
And gets people more invested and more engaged with the ultimate result.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm all about, what my 3 books have in common is about creating better connections between people. Let's Talk is really specific to how to create better connections at work. But I'm always interested in any author or book that offers a new perspective on how to create great connections. And anyway, The Art of Gathering, I would highly recommend it.
Amazing. Thank you, Therese.
Sure.
And I wondered, whilst we're on then the topic of kind of connection and physically being together, do you have any kind of final tips or comments on how obviously Zooming has affected giving feedback instead of being physically together?
I do. So in fact, I wrote an article for Fast Company here just a few months ago about how to give effective feedback over Zoom, and also for Harvard Business Review. So I've written 2 articles on how to give effective virtual feedback, and a couple of tips there. It is harder. If you're finding it harder, you're not alone, right? And part of what's hard about it is that you can't just walk back from a meeting with someone and debrief the meeting, right? It used to be very, very casual, where you would just be like, oh man, I wish when we got to this part of the presentation, and you could just brainstorm right before you even get back to your desks. And we can't do that anymore. Instead, it has to be a formal request. Isabel, can we have a 10-minute meeting? And then it feels right. Then it feels so formal, like dun. Right. So a couple of things. First of all, just make it really transparent that after every event with your team, you're going to do a 5 or 10-minute debrief with that person who's got the big deadline. So if you just had a big presentation, we already know that, we're going to hop on Zoom or the phone for 10 minutes afterwards to debrief, so that people don't freak out when you ask for that, right? If you say to the whole team, we're always going to do this. If I forget, you remind me. And that way it just becomes standard practice, just that same way you would have that time of walking back to your desk together or back to your office. A second thing that's really important, I interviewed someone at a tech company, and she had the great observation that We end meetings so much more abruptly when we're doing it virtually.
Completely.
Right? Right? You
Yeah.
just got like, oh, my dog's barking. Someone just knocked on the door or something,
Gotta
right? You know,
go.
gotta go. Exactly. Or like, oh, wait, it's, it's my turn to do childcare or whatever it might be, right? If you were in the office, you wouldn't suddenly just say to your boss, oops, gotta go, right? At least it's very unlikely.
Yeah.
And what we miss by ending meetings abruptly is we miss the opportunity to review. What did you understand? What did I what was my meaning? Did you get my meaning? And so an important step to do with Zoom, if you have the time while that person's still in the conversation, is to say, what are your 3 key takeaways? If I just gave you a bunch of feedback to say, what do you hear me saying? What's the most important thing for you out of what I've said? So I'm giving you a chance to tell me what you hear. But if you don't get to do that because the person ends the meeting really abruptly, just send an email right after the meeting saying, hey, when you get a moment tonight or tomorrow morning, can you email me what your top 3 takeaways were? And that way, you're making sure that that person understood your core feedback message, but you're also giving yourself a chance to clarify right away, because people, when people walk away from a meeting, there's so much data showing that what you say is not necessarily what they hear. And if anything, they tend to hear a more positive message than you meant. And so doing that clarification, either doing it while you still have them on the Zoom call or doing it over email afterwards, really saves a lot of misunderstanding later. I've talked with multiple people who thought, I'm getting a promotion. And their manager was like, no, you're not getting a promotion. I don't know where you got that, right? But there can be real miscommunications, and it usually just makes for more difficult conversations down the road.
Which is really quite shocking, isn't it, to think that such a big discrepancy could happen in the way that something's articulated and understood. And I guess, that the need to check in afterwards has never been more important, because as you say, you don't have those interactions by the sink, by the kettle, all of those things where you might actually just touch in with the person. Now we're all sat in our individual homes, kind of expecting a promotion and not being given one, and everything in between.
Exactly. And people are, the other thing is that people are feeling not noticed, right? You feel like you're doing work and you're wondering, am I doing what I'm supposed to be doing? So I recommend much more frequent check-ins. If you were someone who kind of just did check-ins spontaneously, make sure you schedule them now, because people are wondering, am I doing, here are the 3 things I'm working on. Are those the 3 priorities for you? Right. But to just be doing those feedback conversations. And you can even say, as a manager, I'm finding I need to do more of these than I have been doing. So I'm going to make this change. We'll try it out. Let's experiment. Let's try to do more check-ins. But simply to say to the person, like, I want to be doing good by you. And I think that I have room for improvement. Here's how I'm trying to improve. And people will appreciate that. All too often people make changes and they don't label it. And then the person doesn't realize that they've tried to make a change. So I'm all for letting people know, like, hey, I want to try this out. Let's experiment with this, and we'll touch base in a week or 2 to see if it's actually helping either of us, or hopefully helping both of us. But I'm a big proponent of labeling things when you make a change.
And going back to the art of gathering, you're getting people to invest in the opportunity. Then you're stating your intent, and they're also bought in because they're also trying to make it happen. So yeah, that's wonderful advice. So thank you so much, Therese. If anybody has got a question, do pop it in. But we will be sharing this chat back, so you'll be able to listen to Therese's advice on how to give more effective feedback. And as I say, you can grab a copy of Let's Talk. If you're in the UK, your copy will look like this.
That's right.
And you can grab a copy of that. And Therese outlines all of the research that's been done, and offers some really practical tips that you can apply to your own day-to-day, on how to give better feedback.
Thank you
so much.
Thank you, Isabel. This is great. And I really hope that people find it helpful. Feedback is stressful, but it doesn't have to be.
Thank you so much, Therese. Chat soon.
Thank you so much, Isabel. Take care.